Good afternoon, everybody. So we forge on to today. Read a couple of passages from the famous Chāndogya Upanishad, and then the Taittirīya Upanishad. For some reason, I haven't assigned many readings for this second part of the week. Normally, I assign a lot more. So maybe I'm getting, as I get older, I come to a position where I think, if I assign too much readings to the students, are the students really going to read it all? So better to have fewer passages and then allow the students to engage them more deeply. So that's my thinking, but you have to do your dharma and read them. And this is the lightest reading, at least the Upanishads, that I've ever had on my syllabus. So we've done this course even a year ago. To speak of 5 years ago, we'd be reading half of the Chāndogya. It's a huge Upanishad. The Upanishads are they're set up chronologically, which means the Brihad Aranyaka is the oldest, and the Chāndogya more or less the same age, or perhaps slightly less old. So the beginning here gives you a little bit of an introduction to the Chāndogya, connects it with its which school it's associated with. So it's connected with the Sama Veda. So each Veda there are 4 strata to the Vedic corpus. The 4 Vedas, and then there's a strata called the Brahmanas. Now, the Brahmanas are a caste, a social caste of, men and women, but mostly men who were doing the ritualistic work, but with females too. And, like anywhere in the ancient world, or even up until the Second World War, and even today, people say that that fields like science and philosophy is still, it's still overwhelmingly male. It's all changing, of course it is, but so nothing unique about ancient India. That it was male Brahmins that mostly were handing down the Vedic traditions, the intellectual traditions and ritualistic traditions, and other traditions. That's the case everywhere in the world, but still today, in the West, it's still male heavy in certain fields. Anyway, so there are the 4 Vedas, and then there's another a genre of text called the Brahmanas. Now we know the Brahmanas, we can count them as the male ritualists and priests. But there's also a genre of text called Brahmanas, so don't get confused. The Brahmanas are both a social caste, and they're also a genre type of text. And where the Vedas are hymns, at least 3 of the Vedas are hymns that are recited during the sacrifice, hymns to the devas, hymns to the celestial being. The Brahmanas are massive, unwieldy, great, a lot of them haven't even been translated, or, they don't really there's not much interest in them today, neither from philosophers nor from, Hinduism specialists, because they're manuals of ritual. Imagine a computer manual in the old days. Nowadays, it took them a couple of decades to realize only computer nerds read the computer manual. So now they just give you a little leaflet. But in the old days, I remember when computers first came out, they had this great big tome all about how to run the computer, and people like me were totally exasperated with it and never read it. Went running to our friends and said, "Can you help me, please?" So if you think of a computer nerd nowadays, I don't mean that at all offensively. It's someone whose mind is attracted to and absorbed into the computer, is fascinated by the infinite possibilities of computers. Well, imagine that someone like that 3,000 years ago might have been a ritualist nerd, and all the little details are very, very intricate, very extremely elaborate. Don't think the ritual is about throwing something in the fire for the gods. You had to chant everything precisely at the right time. No other ritualist, the entire ancient world, most of it, perhaps there's always exceptions, but whether you're talking about Mesoamerica, Babylon, Greco-Roman world, China, Africa, most of the ancient world had, had religiosity in the ancient world had some equivalent, some form of ritual where things were thrown into a fire to please some kind of super normal being. That seems to have been ubiquitous in the ancient world, and no other culture had anything near the sophistication, intricacy, meticulousness, and technical precision and requirements of Vedic ritualism. Everything had to be done perfectly. If one mistake was made, then the entire ritual was considered to be tainted and perhaps started all over again. And you may think that's excessive, but think about it. We mentioned the computer. If you hit the wrong key, you might hit the delete key by accident. The whole thing, get your whole document. In the old days, before cloud, iCloud, and all that, and backup, you could lose very easily. People could, would constantly be losing the entire paper. And, they had a good excuse back then if their papers went in time, because you really could lose the whole thing. Now there's no excuse because everything gets automatically backed up. So these were the Brahmana texts. They were the manuals of how to perform rituals, meticulous details, in meticulous detail. Where do you sit? How you line up the implements? When do you chant this hymn? When? At what point in the ritual? And there were 4 different types of priests. One of them is mentioned here, the Udgatra. He would chant from the Samaveda. And then there was the Hotra, who would actually pour the oblations in the fire, so on and so forth. So Brahmana texts are prose texts. The Vedas are in verse. Brahmana's prose. Details, how, all of it's like manuals of rituals. Then there's a genre of text called the Aranyakas. We won't say too much about it because they have some material that sort of overlaps with the Brahmana material, sort of ritualistic information, and some which overlaps with the Upanishads. They don't have a very clearly defined essence of their own, but they're the third strata of what we call the Vedic corpus, which ends with the Upanishads. Everything else is post-Vedic. I know people use the term Vedic very loosely, but both tradition and modern academic scholars, but also traditional pundits, for them, the Shruti, the Vedas, ends with the Upanishads. So that's the 4th strata. And you'll notice the name of the Upanishad we had last week was Brihad, Great Aranyaka. It's still got the name Aranyaka. So it's half Aranyaka, half Upanishad. Brihad Aranyaka Upanishad. The Aranyakas being the 3rd strata of text. So these Vedas, there are 4, and each of them have their particular Brahmanas connected with that lineage, and their Aranyaka and their Upanishads. So each of the Upanishads will be connected to one of the 4 Vedas. And if you were a Brahmin in one of those lineages, the 4 Vedic lineages, although there were 10 Brahmin families, but these lineages, you would learn your Veda and your set of Brahmanas, Aranyakas, and Upanishads. So this Chāndogya is a section of the Chāndogya Brahmana belonging to the Taittirīya school of Samaveda. So that's one of the Vedas, 4 Vedas, Sama. And they have separate schools. That's all. We don't need to know all of this, just in case you're interested. Very intricate, very precise, and very lineage-based. Everything was handed down with incredible precision. Nothing comparable in the ancient world. When you chanted the Veda, in order to make sure that something didn't drop out in the course of time, you lost a word or a phoneme. If you lose a phoneme every so often over the course of 3,000-4,000 years, imagine how many you could lose. You would end up with a completely different entity. So they would chant them. They would have, little kids at the age of 5 would be memorizing these without even knowing what the meaning was. And you would chant them backwards and forwards to preserve that. So Agneme, me, ni, ag. So you do 1, 2, 3, 3, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, 4, 3, 2, like this. And they had 9 different ways of memorizing. You didn't just memorize the hymns. You memorized it in 9 different ways. Why? To ensure that nothing ever got lost. If you went 1, 2, 3, 3, 2, 1, if something dropped out, there'd be a space there, you'd know. And if you didn't catch it in one method of recitation, you'd catch it in one of the other 9 methods. So basically 3 methods, but some of them had sub-methods. And so therefore, European scholars couldn't believe it when they went to, when they were running around India collecting Vedic texts. I guess in the sort of 19th century and 20th century, they found Rig Vedic, the old Veda, oldest Indo-European text, from Kashmir, and they found recensions from Bengal, and I think there was a southern recension. They've been separated for 3,000 years, yet they were identical. Think about that. If you had a text and it's being handed down in Kashmir, no connection with the same text being handed down with different priestly families in Bengal, and the same down south, any other text, imagine it, just oral, not written down, handed down from father to son, and so on down. I mean, surely in the passage of time, it gets changed. You lose a word, something gets added, something gets dropped, and after 3,000 years, you'd have completely different texts. But that wasn't the case. They were identical. And how do they get to be preserved so precisely? Nothing even remotely close to it anywhere in the ancient world, my friends. How? By these memorization techniques I just described. Anyway, you don't need to know all of that. Just perhaps if you're interested. So we happen to have this up here on the screen as the introduction to this particular Chāndogya. Then this gives you the contents of the entire Chāndogya, in case you're interested. So you have dialogue between Pravahana and two Brahmins, and the high chant. The high chant is Om, the famous Om, which we certainly will talk about at some point. The creation of the Vedas and Om. How do they get created? By the Prajapati, the sort of progenitor of beings. A lot of esoteric stuff. The sevenfold Samana speech and the sun. And it's no good saying, what does this mean? Even now, when we read these passages together, we don't know what it means. It's not like a normal subject. You say to the professor, what does this mean? And you get some kind of a clinical precise. We don't know what it means. We only have what the tradition tells us it means, but sometimes that's many, many, many centuries later. Upanishads, the first commentator we have on the Upanishads, the Brihad, is 8th century BCE. The first commentaries we have on the Brihad are Shankara in the 9th century of the Common Era, my friends. That's 1,600 years later. You could say, well, how do we know Shankara's got it right? Well, probably he's much more likely to get it right than us sitting in the West in the 21st century, one might argue. But still, there's even amongst traditional commentators differences of opinion about what something means, and you'll get a sense of it in some of the verses we'll look at today. Okay, so let's start off with a very few. I don't know why I assigned so few. I'm beginning to think I didn't assign you enough. So feel grateful, or maybe you won't. Maybe you'll lament that I haven't assigned more, and you'll be upset with me, which is a good thing to be, because that means that you like it and you want more. If you're lamenting, I'll understand you're very interested in the Upanishads. So here we are, and we are in the where are we? We're in the 6th book of the Upanishads, 6, section 3, and verse 4. That's the last one. So the number of the page is going to be the last on that page. So actually, this is 2 here. I think it's going to be 2, 3, and 4. No, maybe not. So in the beginning, son. So the Brahmin is talking to his son. I'm not sure if it's Yajnavalkya. Remember Yajnavalkya, he surfaces all over the place. I don't have his name here, and we can check, no problem. So in the beginning, son. All right, let me go and find out who the Brahmana is, just in case we're interested. I'll run and get my book. I'll just hit the pause button for a second. So this is the Brahmana here is Udalaka Aruni, and his famous son Shvetaketu, who surfaces a lot in the Upanishads. So he's imparting knowledge of Brahman to his son, as would be the case. The Brahmana imparts knowledge to the son. These traditions are handed down in the family, as anywhere else in the world. In the beginning, son, remember we're thinking about beginnings, God, this point being, and why What's the relationship between God and beginnings? Well, God is the creator, according to most theists, and certainly the intelligence support and sustainer of the universe. So when we talk about beginnings, we're talking about the cause of all causes, the ultimate cause. In the beginning, sun, this world was simply what is existent. And the Sanskrit here is sat, that which is. Let me explain what sat is grammatically. And bear with me, don't switch off. There's not a linguistics class, but I think you'll find this useful and interesting. Sat is the present active participle. Okay, what is a present active participle? It's the ing form of a verb. Walking, talking, running. So when someone is in an ing verbal state, it's an ongoing state. You're walking, it means you're right now you're walking and you're continually walking. Walked is past, you're not walking anymore. Will walk is future. Well, you will do it in the future. But what if you're walking right now? You're walking. That's called it's present. And it's active, you're doing it, and it's a participle. You can't just say walking. It has to, it's an adjective. It goes with a noun. Someone's walking, a man is walking, a woman is walking. So it's a present active participle. Present, active, ongoing. Participle means an adjective. It needs a noun to qualify it. So what's the noun here? The world exists. It was sat. Sat is being. It's being. We don't say ising in English. Something is, but let's make up a word, ising. Sometimes if you make up a word, it forces you to step out of your box and think of things a little bit differently. We say being. Being, actually, if there were a word ising, it would simply mean being. What would be the difference? If something is, then it has a state of being. So that's the name of the absolute. One of the descriptors. Brahman is the ultimate name in the Upanishads, but its nature is it's always existing. It's always in the ing state. As long as something is in the in state, it doesn't stop. So another way of thinking of something in the ing state is it's eternal. If you're always walking, you never stopped, well, you'd be eternally walking, wouldn't you? As long as you're in that ing state, the present active state. So Brahman is that. It's always in a present active state of existing. So we can say he's translated as existent, but existing would be more closer to the actual Sanskrit sat. So it is sat. And we might as well get used to 3 words, sat, chit, ananda. Right now we're just talking about sat. But we're going to run into the idea of chit, that it's not just existing, because it could be inanimate, could be dead and existing. Could be an inanimate thing, like a rock. Could be just ing. It could be ising and being. A rock could be ising since the Big Bang. Well, maybe not quite since the Big Bang, but atoms are ising. Subatomic particles are ising since the very, very early phases of post-Big Bang, right? So, but that's nothing interesting about that. But so the word chit gets added. It's not just ising and being, but it's intelligence. And then ananda will at some point also get added that it's blissful. And that gets added by Vedanta. So right now we're just saying it's existent. One only, one without a second. The cause of all causes, before creation, before this world emerges, this world of name and form. Now on this point, some do say in the beginning this world was simply what is non-existent. So there was a difference of opinion. It's not that everybody had the same views. There was just as much intellectual variegatedness back then as there is in any point in Indian history or human history or our modern intellectual world. So some people said there were people back then. We don't know, he's not saying who they were. But in the beginning, this world was simply the non-existent. One only without a second. There was just non-existence with nothing else. And from what is non-existent was born what is existent. That from nothing comes creation. Now, who says something like that? How about the creation? How about Bible, Genesis, the beginning, God creates the world. Well, God might have been eternal, but he creates the world out of nothing. The Indian traditions have never, ever given any serious intellectual attention to that proposal. For them, it's not even worth arguing against. They a priori don't even intellectually engage, not because they don't intellectually engage things, but because for them it wasn't even a serious proposal that something could come from nothing. So look at this. He just immediately rejects it. But son, how can that possibly be? I mean, there were people back then that said that. But someone like what's his name again? Adulaka Aruni. He goes, how can that possibly be? He continued, how can what is existent be born from what is non-existent? How can something come from nothing? I think science would accept that, right? I mean, whatever the initial moment of that big, that big bang, whatever that initial instant was of infinitely dense matter, whatever scientists say about it, was something. So the idea that something can come from nothing, he just rejects us. On the contrary, son, in the beginning, this world was simply what is existent, the one only, without a second. We skipped a few verses. That doesn't matter. How did we end up down there? Oh, no, we didn't. This is all introduction. I can't believe I gave you so little to read. All right, that's fine. Let's spend more time on it. And it thought to itself, so what does this mean? Shit. Intelligence. Thinking. The sign of intelligence. So now we've got a cause in the beginning, something existing. In a present active participle means it's always been existing. It's always been walking, talking, speaking. In this case, always been existing. It doesn't say there wasn't a time when it didn't exist. He's just rejected that. There was no and never any non-existent, only an existence. So what does that mean? That it is eternally existing. It wasn't like way back in some conceptual time. There was a period of non-existence and then existence emerges from. No, it's always been the present active state. So you might as well call it eternal. Number one, Sat, eternal. Number two, it's thought. Chit, intelligence. Okay, so this ultimate entity, and of course, God, in later, much more theologized traditions, clearly God exists and God is not just intelligent, but omniscient. But that these sort of those kinds of theologies will emerge later. Right now, we're just very, very early days, very basic, profound, but very sort of basic categories. So it exists and it thought, let me become many, let me propagate myself, so let me create. So it emitted heat. And the heat thought to itself, let me become many, let me propagate myself. It emitted water. So in Indian metaphysics, a number of the schools see reality as actually evolving from subtler into grosser entities. That gets refined quite, it reaches a sort of metaphysical culmination in the school of Sankhya. It's going to say from intelligence comes ego, from ego comes, comes subtle qualities, and then from that come the gross elements, ether, air, water, fire, and earth. I beg your pardon. Fire, water, and earth. So here we have a sort of very, very, very primordial proto. Proto means an undeveloped early form of something that's not really developed, but just glimpse at it. But the heat thought to itself from heat. So the idea is probably metaphoric, the heat thinking to itself, let me become many, and it became water. Whatever whenever it is hot, therefore, a man surely perspires, and you get this sort of little proto-science. If it's hot, you perspire, and that shows that water comes from heat. He's giving an example of how one can think about, well, how are we supposed to think about water coming from fire? Well, he says, well, when it's hot, you perspire. So there's an example, a simple example. Okay, we can call this very proto-science. And thus from heat, and thus it is from heat that water is produced. The water thought to itself, let me become many, let me propagate myself. It emitted food. In the later metaphysical traditions, food meaning earth, earth-like substances, solids. So from energy comes liquids, from gases and energy come liquids, and from liquids solids. We might those might be categories that are a bit more, we might be a bit more familiar with if we were trying to sort of find language in our modern day and age to fit this, right? We're trying to enter into a very, very early mindset, and we're trying to see the logic and the coherence and this is systematic, exposition in its own little way. Even though the Upanishads are not very systematic, but still, this is a coherent sort of, explanation of things. Now he gives a little example as to how from water solids come. So he says, well, look, whenever it rains, therefore food becomes abundant, it rains, and then we get solids emerge from the earth, plants and food. And then he says, okay, there's your example, and thus it is from water that foodstuffs are produced. Okay, so what's of interest to us here is that there is a beginning to everything that exists, has always existed, and that it has thinking powers. So here is our some of the earliest references to what later becomes Ishvara. Or the later traditions would see these kinds of references as references to Ishvara. Of course, Ishvara gets much more theologized and systematized in later theism. Okay, now we're jumping to chapter 6, section 11, verse 2. This one up here was 634, a bit further on. Okay, now we get to a part of the Upanishads that's going to be very influential or a very important issue in Vedanta that we turn to next after the Upanishads. And one of the issues is, what's the relationship between Atman and Brahman? We've already discussed that often Brahman seems to refer to the cosmic and Atman to the individual aspect of it, spark of it, little portion of it, perhaps, unksha. But what's the relationship? Is it just the relationship of a spark to the fire, pretty much made of the same, luminous, hot, but one's tiny, one's much larger? Is Brahman the everything and Atman just the manifestations of it in living beings? Are they distinct? Or ultimately, if you put the spark back in the fire, it becomes a fire again. It's not really an individual. It seems to be an individual. It spits out of the fire. But if you pick up a spark like an ember and put it back in the fire, it just merges back into the fire. Is that the relationship? Or is the spark eternally a spark with the qualities of the fire, but an eternally minute, infinitesimal expression of it? The Vedanta traditions divide on this. Please pay attention to what I'm going to say next. I'm going to use two terms, monism and monotheism. And I'm going to define how I use them, which is pretty normative, but still sometimes people define these differently. So we both have a monism and monotheism. The Vedanta traditions are going to be divided into Advaita, non-dual. Mono is, if something is mono, just one, then that means it's non-dual, not two. So the Sanskrit way of referring to what we call monism, we don't really say non-dualism in English. We say monism. Also for the traditions in the West or other traditions that have similar features, we call them monistic traditions, meaning that ultimately everything merges back into one, or is an expression of one. And somehow or other, all the differences that we see are temporary, but that ultimate truth that everything sort of goes back into some sort of a oneness with no distinctions. Those kinds of traditions are called monistic. And there's many different types of monistic traditions. And basic common denominator is that there is one underlying truth, and everything that emerges from it is only temporarily emerges from it. But it's some ideal point, everything merges back into the oneness. So for example, drops of rain may emerge from the ocean. The sun evaporates water from the ocean, it becomes cloud, it rains. And now there's individual drops of rain coming out of the cloud, but as soon as they hit the ocean again, when it rains over the ocean, that drop of rain, what happens when it hits the ocean? Monism. It goes back into the one. So it looks like there's drops of rain that are distinct, but they're only temporarily distinct. Eventually they all go back into the one. That's monism. Now, the famous monistic tradition of Vedanta is the 8th, 9th century Shankaracharya. The great teacher, Shankara. Acharya means teacher, Shankara. He wasn't the first Advaita, and Advaita is the school, non-dualism, which is monism. Dvaita. We discussed this in the introduction, non-dual. And he wasn't the first, but he was the most famous and established the Advaita Vedanta tradition. Vedanta is the cluster of traditions that seek to interpret the Vedas in a systematic way. They're called Vedanta. We'll reach them next week. Don't worry if you don't get it all now. You'll be much clearer when we get to Vedanta, the actual Vedanta section of the course, which is after the Upanishads. So there are different types of Vedanta: Advaita, Vishishtadvaita, and Dvaita, dualism. So the more dualistic Vedanta traditions say no. Brahman is the Atman is an individual, eternally individual. And Brahman may be the support of everything, and everything may rest in Brahman, but the world is real, it's real, the souls are real, and Brahman is ultimately a personal being. The monistic traditions, Brahman is impersonal. It's just this consciousness that we just read about in the previous verse. It's just existent intelligence, conscious, intelligent, impersonal, meaning there's no personality, no kind of God type figure. It's just a kind of all-pervading intelligent consciousness that underpins everything. Shankar goes so far as to say, actually, everything is really an illusion. There isn't, it seems there's a world out there, but it's not real. Okay, now these passages lend themselves to a monistic interpretation. Let's see if we can see why that's so. So, now take the bees, son. Okay, we've got bees. I have a beehive right over there in my yard. And beautiful creatures. They prepare the honey by gathering nectar from a variety of trees, right? You have some bees, they go around and they're picking up nectar from the different flowers. So they gather nectar from a variety of trees, and by reducing that nectar to a homogeneous whole, once they go back to the hive, that nectar, which seems to be distinctive, merges into the honey. It loses its distinctiveness, right? It just goes into a homogeneous or kind of monistic whole. In that state of homogeneity, the nectar from each different tree, right? So, the pear tree, the apple tree, they're different. But once it goes back to the hive and merges, it's not, the nectar from each different tree is not able to differentiate, I am the nectar of that tree. And then the other bit of nectar says, well, I am the nectar of this other tree. So just as that's the case, all the nectar, all the different pollen from the flower, once they get to the hive, it all merges into the honey, the same one honey, homogeneous, no variety. It's just one entity called honey. In exactly the same way, son, says Udalaka Aruni, when all these creatures, all living creatures, you, I, the Atman within us, that which animates us, when we merge into the existent, remember this is the term for Brahman, because it's a quality of Brahman. Just like God, right? You might say the Almighty. Well, almightiness is a quality of God. So sometimes rather than say God the Almighty, you just say the Almighty. So rather than say Brahman, that which is eternally existent, you can just say the existent, Sat. Same thing. So when all these creatures merge into the existent, the Sat, all of us, they're not able to be, they're not aware of, just like the different trees are not aware, the nectar, once it gets to the honey, it's not aware, oh, I'm a pear tree nectar, or I'm an apple tree nectar. So all these creatures, they're not aware that we're merging into the existent. No matter what they are in this world, a tiger, a lion, a wolf, a boar, a worm, a moth, a gnat, or a mosquito, they all merge into that. The Atman is the same in all creatures, my friends. The life is the same. It's just like a battery. You have the same, a little, AAA battery can be in a toy, it can be in a torch, it can be in many different pieces of machinery which act differently, but the battery is the same in all of them. From the outside, they all look different. Maybe one, toys jump up in the air, or they walk, or whatever they do, and the torch, is luminous, and they look completely different, but actually they're being animated by the same thing. So likewise with the tiger, the worm, the boar, the moth, you could have added a blade of grass as well. They all have the same battery. They all merge into that. So this is monistic. This suggests that when the Atman gets free of the body, and somehow, right, later on, we're going to get a much more developed notions of liberation, of how you get free of the body. That's all coming later in the later traditions. Right now, just basic, early, not very philosophically argued, not philosophically argued at all. But we get the earliest seeds of what later gets developed in the later schools. And here this is monistic, because they merge into Brahman. That's monism. Once they hit Brahman, there's no more two. Right? You got 100 raindrops, and they're all 100. It looks like there's 100 of them. The minute they hit the ocean, they're just all ocean. There's only one. Same way, they all merge into that. So this finest essence here, that constitutes the self of this whole world, the Atman. That is the truth. That is the Atman. That's how you are, Shvetaketu. You're my son. You're also Atman. So Shvetaketu likes that. Sir, teach me more. Very well, son. Now remember the Upanishads. They're going to change the metaphor, these first 3 lines, but the refrain, this part's going to be the same. So now he's going to say exactly the same teaching, changing the metaphor from bees and honey to rivers and ocean. But then when we get here, in exactly the same way, from the 3rd line onwards, 4th line, it's exactly the same as this. Okay? Why? Well, you may say this is repetitive. We discussed it already. Remember why? Because you're hearing it. If you're hearing it, you have no opportunity to, with a book, you read it, you forgot it, you go back and read it again, find the page number, write it down. You don't, none of that. You hear it. So if you didn't quite get it, we're very happy if the teacher repeats it. And to change it up a little bit, make it sound a little different, you just change the metaphor. So here's the metaphor change. The change that's taking place is now a riverine metaphor. Now take these rivers, son. The easterly ones flow towards the east, the westerly ones flow towards the west. From the ocean, they merge into the very ocean. They become just the ocean. In that state, they're not aware that I am that river, I am this river. Then, Ganga, the Hudson, the Thames, looks like they're just completely distinctive things. When we think of the Ganga, we think of a distinct entity. But what happens when it hits the ocean? We think the Ganga is over in India, Thames is in London, Hudson over here. As if we think of them as different rivers, but that's just an illusion. The minute they hit the ocean, they're the ocean. So to think that I'm me, you're you, I'm a man, I'm a woman, I'm a bug, from a Vedanta point of view, this is illusion. We're really all the same Atman. So what happens when all of these easterly river, the westerly ones, right, from the ocean, they emerge into the very ocean. They come from the ocean, right? Rivers come from rain, which comes from the ocean, and they go back to the ocean. So from the ocean, they merge into the ocean, they become just the ocean. And now we have the same refrain as up here, as verse 9. In exactly the same way, son, when all of these creatures reach the existent, the sub, they're not aware that we are reaching the existent. No matter what they are in this world, and here exactly the same, whether it's a tiger, a lion, a wolf, a boar, they merge into that, all the same, everything else the same. The finest essence here that constitutes the self of this whole world, that is the truth. That is the Atman, and that's how you are, Shvetaketu. And he likes this. Sir, teach me more. You should all be like Shvetaketu. You send me emails, Professor Bryant, teach me more. But you said that makes the teacher happy when students are enthusiastic about the material. Well, he's a good student. Well, he's his son. Maybe he's just being nice to his dad. But Shvetaketu is a famous character, and a few stories involving him, a few narratives involving him in the Upanishads. Okay, now same thing, change the metaphor, right? Honeys and bees and the honey, rivers and ocean. How about sap in the tree? A little bit different, actually. No, I beg your pardon. This is slightly different teaching here. Now take this huge tree, son. If someone were to hack it at the bottom, its living sap would flow. Likewise, if someone were to hack it at the middle, its living sap would flow. And if someone were to hack it at the top, its living sap would flow. So in other words, what's the point? Sap is pervading the entire tree. What's a metaphor for? Consciousness pervades the entire body. Slightly different teaching than the previous one. Previous 2 verses were about what happens when consciousness leaves the body. When it gets liberated, it merges into Brahman. What are the teachings here? The teachings here are that The one Atman, while it's in the body, right? We're not talking about what happens after death or after liberation, but when it's in the body, it pervades the whole body. So if you touch me here, I feel my consciousness feels it. You touch me here, it feels it. You touch me on the leg, I feel it. So likewise with the tree, the sap being the correlate to consciousness. So pervaded by the jiva essence, the Atman, this tree stands here ceaselessly drinking water and flourishing. When, however, life leaves one of its branches, that branch withers away. So you can lose consciousness in an arm. People, have a withered arm and they're not conscious of anything. The consciousness no longer flows there. So he's giving the example of the tree, same thing. When it leaves a second branch, that likewise withers away. And when it leaves a third branch, that also withers away. When it leaves the entire tree, the whole tree withers away. Okay, so when consciousness could leave limbs of the body, but the Atman could still be in the body, but one could lose a limb or consciousness would lose consciousness in a limb. But when it leaves the body, then the entire body withers. So in exactly the same way, he continued, know that this, of course, dies when it is bereft of life, but life itself does not die. This is the body. This body, made of flesh and blood and marrow and bones, dies when it's bereft of life. But what is that life? Life does not die. It's sat. It's present active participle. It always is in the ing state. It's always ising. It's always being. It always is. Put into proper English, it always exists. And to paraphrase that, it is eternal. Something always exists, eternal. And then we have the same refrain. It's a slightly different teaching, but the same refrain. The finest essence here that constitutes the self of this whole world. That is the truth, that is the self, and that's how you are. Shvetaketa, famous line. That's how you are. Tat tvam asi. This is considered a Mahavakya, a great Upanishadic statement. A Mahavakya literally means a great statement. And a Mahavakya is something that captures a profound truth in very few words. So if, for example, what would be a Mahavakya of Christianity? What little phrase captures the essence of Christianity? Maybe, this is me talking, because Christianity doesn't have Mahavakya, but if we were to look for an equivalent, I would say something like, turn the other cheek. Love thy neighbor as thyself. 3-4 words. Captures the heart of Christianity. Do unto others. The whole thing being, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. So these little pithy statements are profound, they're succinct, they kind of take on a life of their own. We in normal, even if you're not Christian or anything, you could say to someone, do unto others, or turn the other cheek, or love thy neighbor as thyself. These are Mahavakyas. So what's the Mahavakya here? Tattvamasi, you are that. We are somehow, and this is what separates the different Vedanta schools. Remember, the monist schools are going to understand this one way, monotheistics another way, but they all agree that we are somehow connected to that ultimate God from using the language of this course. Brahman is the language we're using right now in the Upanishads. But somehow we are that. Now, are we that in the same way as a drop of water goes back to the ocean and then really actually becomes, it no longer is a drop of water, it literally becomes that? Or are we the same quality as God, but internally distinct and bound in a relationship of love and devotion and relationship? Those differences are at the root of the differences between the Vedanta traditions we get to later, so we don't need to, they have their origins here. This is something that the non-dual traditions, Advaita, like these passages. This Tattvamasi, this Mahavakya, this great saying, Mahavakya, and that's how you are in Sanskrit. It's Tat, that, Tvam, you are, Asi. Tat, Tvam, Asi. That's the Mahavakya for the Advaita Vedanta, the non-dual schools, the monistic schools. Okay? So that's the Chāndogya, and we'll go into the Taittirīya, also very early, but usually dated slightly later. And here's the history. It's an Aranyaka. Remember, that's the third strata of text. We have the 4 Vedas, then the Brahmana text, then the Aranyakas, and then the Upanishads. And this particular Upanishad is connected to the Taittirīya Brahmana of the black Yajurveda. Yajurveda, one of the four Vedas, and there's a black one and there's a white one. So the four Vedas, they divide into different kinds of branches. And then once it's divided, then you get various Brahmanas and Aranyakas and Upanishads. And here the name is the same. The Taittirīya Upanishad is part of the Taittirīya Brahmana. The Taittirīya Upanishads, part of the Taittirīya Aranyaka, part of the Taittirīya Brahmana. So the name is the same of the Upanishad, the Aranyaka, the Brahmana, and then it's tagged onto the Yajurveda, the black one. But sometimes the names are not quite as obviously connected as is the case here. So here we have the contents, if you're interested. And let's read some of this. Is a famous verse. May it help us both together. May it foster us both together. Together let us both act boldly. May our learning be full of vigor. May we never dislike each other. It's just kind of a nice, let everybody love, let there be love in the world sort of ancient Vedic chant. And it's actually recited at marriages and other kinds of functions, even today. It's called the Brahmavali. I memorized it once. Sahana bhavatu, sahana bhonaktu, sahavidya karavavahai, tejasvina vadit, and I forget the rest. I could make it up, but there's 5 lines like that. Very nice. Actually, once there was a couple sort of getting married in Brooklyn, and they wanted to have an alternative kind of a yogically alternative. It was new agey sort of marriage, and they wanted to have sacred, auspicious chants from different traditions. So they asked me to come and do something from the Vedic tradition, and they wanted this recited. So I went along and recited it for them. So it's used in those sorts of ways. Okay, this is important. So in the Taittirīya, we get this. You don't get the triplet Sat, Chit, Ananda, which becomes, the very famous little set of qualities of Brahman. Brahman is Sat and Chit and Ananda. We've already had Sat, existent, right, present active participle, being, Chit, thought, intelligence, and Ananda, blissful. We don't get those 3 words together. The closest we get are these 3 words. A man who knows Brahman obtains the highest there is. Okay, Brahman is the cause of everything, source of everything. On this, we have the following verse. Truth and knowledge, the infinite. So we get these 3 words, not Sat, Chit, and Ananda, but 3, this is truth. That's Satyam, not Sat, but Satyam. Knowledge is Jnanam, and the infinite. Anantam, not Ananda with a D, which is bliss. Right, later on Vedanta, it's going to be Sat, Chit, Ananda, which is bliss. This is Ananta with a T, which means infinite. So we get these 3 little terms together. This Brahman is somehow truth, knowledge, and it's infinite, not limited by space and time. So it's beyond space and time. If it's beyond space, then it has no boundaries. It's not contained in any way. So then if it's not contained, it must be infinite. It has no finitude or finitude, no limits. So it's infinite. And it's truth, it's satyam, it's that which is. And if something is, then it's true. If something actually exists, then you can say it truly exists. So then you can just say it's true. So you see the connection between existence and truth. They sound like 2 different things. But when you think about it, if something genuinely exists, then it is true. It truly exists. And if it truly exists, you can just say it's true. If it's true, then it must exist. And knowledge, the infinite, and Brahman, the man who knows them as hidden in the deepest cavity, right? So where is that? The Atman. This is the Brahman in the Atman, and hidden in the highest heaven. What's that? Well, that's Brahman. So here we have a nice little connection between the internal Atman and the cosmic Brahman, which is not clearly systematized in the Upanishads, but we get references to this Brahman as being both in the deepest cavity, that's the cavity of the heart, Whenever they talk about the cavity, they're talking about because even in the Upanishads already, they speculate that where does this consciousness which pervades the body, remember, like the sap pervades the tree, but where does it originate from? What's its spreading out? So it must have the point of origin. And they would say the Atman is the substance, or some schools would say that, not all. The theists, the monotheists, those that hold that the soul is distinct from God and the world, would say it's a substance and it has a quality. The soul, Atman, is a substance and the quality of consciousness. So then if it's a substance, where is it located in there? And they call it the cavity or the cave of the heart, another term that's perhaps more frequently used. And the cavity actually might be just his translation for the cave. Because look, cavity, cave, same sort of word. So a man who knows them, hidden in the deepest cavity, hidden in the highest heaven. Why is it hidden? We can't see it. Well, if something's hidden, then what? You can't see it. Can I see my Atman? No. Can I see Brahman underpinning it? Everything? No. So then it's hidden. Call it invisible, but you could also call it hidden. So a man who knows them as hidden in the deepest cavity, hidden in the highest heaven, attains all his desires together with the wise Brahman. You know everything. And therefore, there's nothing left to be known. So all your desires are fulfilled, or perhaps they evaporate. Later tradition's going to say. And here we have very, very early kind of creation. There's a number of different creation narratives. Very simple and ancient. So from this Atman, so now we have the sense of Atman as Brahman, as the cosmic whole. Remember, I told you they can be interchangeable. Even though usually Brahman is the cosmic whole and Atman the individual whole, and certainly that's what it starts to become more consistently in later Vedanta, but in the Upanishads, they can be used interchangeably. So here we have Atman being used for what normally is Brahman, the cosmic sustainer, the sort of cause of all causes, not just a little fraction in our own hearts, in the cave of the heart. So this very self Atman, from it, did space come into being? From space, air. So we have this idea of the evolution, the densification of creation, from subtle to dense. So from space, from that came space. From space, air, space being ether. From air, fire. From fire, the waters. From waters, the earth. From the earth, then plants. Right? Plants are made of atoms and solids, we might say today. They said earth, but with a sort of sense of solidity. Plants, from plants, food, from food, man. So here, okay, we live from food, and food comes from plants come from earth, and so on. Now, a man here is formed from the essence of food. What are we formed from? Our bodies are made from the intake of food. Food gets transformed into our bodies, right? Some of you doing biology, you can give us a technical modern way of expressing that, but basically, right, you could come up with all the language of molecules and genes or whatever. Well, basically, what is it? Eat, and food becomes your body, right? You can just boil it down to so they're not interested in the details of material makeup. They're interested in the source of consciousness. They're interested in what is consciousness and what is the cause of this world. They wouldn't have any argument with modern science. All right, fine. Call it molecules, genes, call it whatever you want to call it. Atoms, subatomic, gluons, strings. Analyze it any way you want. What we're interested in, what is consciousness? How come I'm consciously observing this world? What is the consciousness that is observing it and engaging in science and analyzing it through scientific categories? What's that conscious source of any kind of investigation, of thinking itself? That's what they're interested in. Whether you would talk about Earth or whether you would talk about, atoms, it doesn't matter. That's just an analysis of the external. You don't need to argue about that. So there we have it. Now, a man here is formed from the essence of food. This here is his head. This is right side. This is left side. And then they recite a little verse, which I don't think is part of it. I cut out a lot of the obscure stuff. It's an introduction to Indian philosophy. Don't get bogged down in obscure stuff that, you know, nobody can tell you necessarily what it means. Can't say, what does it mean? You can say, well, you could read it this way, you could read it that way. Let's see what we think of this. Again, you're entitled to wonder, what does this mean? I can tell you how I read it, given all of my, you know, study of this material for half a century. It doesn't mean I'm right. And I take the commentators very seriously. I feel whatever they say, even if the first commentator, we don't have any writing, Shankara, we mentioned 8th to 9th century, the Advaita, monist, non-dualist. Let's get used to his name. We're going to be meeting. I'm going to keep, you know, repeating these terms because some of you have no background, and I want to honor that and try to help you by repeating things. So he may be 8th century, so okay, fine, maybe he's 1,000 years after this, but he's closer than we are. And there must have been lineages. We know there were lineages. The commentaries themselves talk about lineages. The Upanishads talk about lineages. All of this was handed down in lineages, there's no question. Didn't float around. It was all of it. So the fact that the lineages didn't necessarily write down everything, but it would have been handed down. And we know from Vedic recitation how faithful a lot of those, well, of course, a little bit different with the Vedas, because you're not really handing down meaning or interpretation. You're handing down just the hymns themselves, the chants. What's important in Vedic ritual is the sound, not the meaning. You have to in the old Vedas, in the Brahmanas, what's important is the sound, the phonemes, and they have to be uttered exactly right. High, medium, low. What's important is you get exactly the high, weak syllables, strong, guru, laghu, heavy syllables, light syllables. What's important is you get all that right. Doesn't matter what it means. That's Veda. Upanishads and meaning is important. What are the teachings? And they would have been, and because of that, then you have different schools that interpret it differently. There's no different, to my knowledge, there's no different ways of reciting. And if they are, they're minimal. Everyone agrees that there's a set way of reciting. If it's a heavy syllable, meaning if it's a vowel before a conjunct, it's heavy. If it's a long vowel, it's heavy. And I can't remember if heavy syllables go up or down, but there are rules that everybody agrees upon. So Vedic recitation is standardized. There's no different ways of reciting. If there are, they're very minimal differences. I don't know if there are, but I'm just saying. Even if there were, we run into them, it'd be minimal, but not. That's because it's just phonetic chanting. When you get to the Upanishads, it's content, meaning, wisdom traditions, esoteric. I don't like that term esoteric. It's a bit too vague. So anyway, you do have different schools, but nonetheless, these teachings are handed down for for two millennia, 3 millennia. This Taittirīya is probably 6th century BCE. By scholarly dates, traditional pundits would say it's eternal, actually, or certainly very, very ancient. So I'm always interested in even though they're much later, well, what do they think it means? Because they are going to be accessing lineages that we know nothing about, that have been handed down orally. I mean, I personally met pundits that can recite all of these texts just by heart. They don't necessarily write it down. So decide what you think this means. If a man thinks Brahman is the non-existent, he becomes himself non-existent. If a man thinks Brahman is the existent, then people know him to be existent. So I would read this as saying, if a person doesn't believe in Brahman or God, then he becomes non-existent, means that he loses the opportunity to realize his truth, to realize his Atman, to realize Brahman, and he just gets reincarnated. In that sense, he doesn't become literally non-existent, but he loses that opportunity. But if he understands that Brahman is the existent, and he seeks that, then he attains his own existing self, his deeper self. That's how I would read it. But, I don't have a monopoly on interpretation. But I'm sure Shankara would read it like that, and we can check sometime. But that's, later on. Of that, this here is the embodied self. This belongs to the former. Right. Now, the following questions arise from this. Does any man who knows this not attain that world when he dies? Or does any man who knows this attain that world when he dies? Just the question is posed. If you don't know it, can you attain Brahman? If you do know it, can you attain Brahman? It's not the questions aren't answered; they're just posed. But obviously, I would sort of take this as being rhetorical to say, well, you have to know it if you want to attain it. And then we have another passage. He had this desire. So here, this is the cause, the Sat, the beginning, the Brahman had a desire. So we have the sense of a personal being that exists, that thinks and had a desire. And from the desire comes creation. If you're going to create, you have the desire to create. So he had this desire. Let me multiply myself. Let me produce offspring. So he heated himself up. Remember, from heat comes whatever water, from water, earth. When he'd heated himself up, by the way, this means tapas. Tapas means austerity. But the word austerity, tap, means heat. So somehow there's a connection between austerity and heat. When he'd heated himself up, he emitted this whole world. Everything that is here. So this is another creation story. After emitting it, he entered that very world. Or could this be the Atmans? He generated Atmans, and the Atmans and animated the world and animated all the forms, the trees, the plants, the animals. And after entering it, he became Sat and Chat, the distinct and the indistinct. We had this passage before. You know, you can say spirit and matter, consciousness and unconsciousness, the resting and the never resting, the perceived and the non-perceived, the real and the unreal, the satyam and the unreal. He became the real, everything that is here. That is why people call all this Sat. It's real, it exists, always existing. On this too, we have the following verse. So we'll have one more. The fear of it makes the wind blow. The fear of it makes the sun rise. It's raining, my friends. I may have to go inside in a minute. I'll stick it out for a second. I don't want my computer to get wet. The fear of God, right? This could be a hymn this could be a passage in the Old Testament. The fear of God makes the wind blow. The fear of it makes the sun rise. The fear of it makes them run. Fire and moon and death, the fifth. Okay, so we've spoken about Brahman as being Sat, it exists, Chit, right? It's thinking, it's desiring, so it's conscious, it's intelligence. How about bliss, the third, Sat, Chit, Ananda, the third term in that triplet? We got Sat, we got Chit, we got Ananda. Now is an analysis of Ananda. So write down bliss equals Ananda. I'm going to go inside, my friends. So give me a second to hit the stop button and go inside, and then I'm just going to pause recording. Here we go. Okay, we are recording again, and back we go. Let's bring this up, and onward we go. So here we get the Upanishad trying to give a sense of what is this bliss of Brahman. What is this bliss of Brahman? It's something completely different, right, than anything we've experienced. If I say to you, what's your bliss? What are you going to say? You're going to say, well, I like, whatever it is that you like. Some may say, well, I like watching movies, that's my bliss. I like eating, that's my bliss. I like a particular kind of coffee, that's my bliss. So our only understanding of bliss is of experiences that we've encountered that are material, are made of property, made of matter, which leave an imprint in our mind. We call it memory, and it's called a samskara in Sanskrit. So our senses contact sense objects, right? And I get lots of students say, "What's that backdrop behind you?" It's a painting of Krishna. It's a mandala of Krishna Lila. So this is Krishna with the gopis, and then various little episodes from his life, and the little paintings around, and it's kind of a mandala. So it's beautiful. It's Orion silk, hand painted. So the only way we can answer that question is if I say to you, what's your bliss? The first thing is you go into your memory, and your memory contains imprints of experiences. And what are those experiences? They're experiences of material things. So you say, well, my bliss is sleeping, or whatever it might be. But set that food. Add anything you want to the list. But they're all memories of material experiences. Experiences of the senses contacting a sense object. Get used to that language. That's the kind of language that we're going to find, especially in yoga. That's one thing.
right? In yoga, you're going to have the sense that the language of a sense, contacting a sense object. Okay, the tongue contacts the pizza. You eat the pizza, or you eat a sweets and chocolate. It registers the taste. It gets recorded in the mind. And then I say to you, "What's your bliss?" And then you go into your memory and you remember the chocolate. You compare it to your other things that you like, and you say, "Well, chocolate is my number one bliss." So, but the senses can't see Brahman. Mind can't grasp it. So how can we, so if we say Brahman is bliss, how do we understand that? We can only compare it to our material things, but Brahman is non-material. It's prior, it's the cause, it's consciousness. So how do you convey the bliss of Brahman? Well, the author of these passages did the best he could. And he tries to give some example in our frame of reference to give a sense of how the bliss of Brahman far eclipses anything we might call bliss in our experience. So off he goes. Now it follows an analysis of bliss. Now take a young man or a young woman, a good young person who's learned, right? So really good karma, good, learned, quick, solidly built, strong, healthy, all best possible physique you can imagine. So say, take a person like that, making up a story. And then he says, assume he owns this whole world filled with wealth. Okay, not only has he got a healthy, perfect body, he owns everything. So he's wealthy, he's healthy. So all of that, imagine all of that, someone with perfect health, perfect body, owning the whole world, that's one measure of bliss. Let's call that one unit of bliss. Now, it goes up to the next realm, celestial realm. They're called the Gandharvas. Now, a single measure of bliss that the human Gandharvas enjoy is 100 times greater than this. What's this? This is the person who owns the whole world. Well, then, so that's one unit of bliss. Now, the Gandharvas, one unit of their bliss equals 100 of that young man, 100 times the bliss of someone who has perfect health and owns the whole world. You have to have 100 of those to equal one bliss of the Gandharvas. And then it keeps going up the celestial realm. And a single measure of bliss that the divine Gandharvas enjoy is 100 times greater than the bliss of human Gandharvas. So now the next realm, one unit of that bliss is 100 of the Gandharvas. So now you got to do 100 times 100. So what do you got? 10,000. Do the math, somebody. So one unit of the third realm is 10,000 the human who owns the whole world. And he goes up like this. How many realms? It's the same thing. A single measure of bliss at the next is 100 of that of the previous one, which is 100 of the Gandharvas, which is 100 of the humans, and then the next realm, the gods by birth, and then the next one, the gods by performing rites, and and one time we wrote this up on the board, and I think we ended up with, maybe one of you can do the math here. I think it was 10 to the power of 17. If somebody wants to do the math and email me, I'll let you all know next week. Right, because look at all the realms. In other words, you've got to multiply each of these 100 the previous number. So you start off with the human, and then the Gandharva. One of that is 100, so now you got 100, and then the next one is 100 of the one of the next realm is 100 of the Gandharvas, which is 100. So you have to multiply 100. Each of these realms you multiply it by another 100. Somebody do the math. Send me an email, and then a single measure of the I don't know how many realms is this? 7 or 8. So where are we? We've got the Gandharvas, the human Gandharvas, divine Gandharvas, forefathers, gods by birth, gods by performing rites, gods, some other gods, it just says gods, Indra, now we're on number 7, Brihaspati 8, Prajapati 9, and so now you've got 9 realms. So you've got 9 times 100 times 100, 9 times. Somebody do the math. And a single measure of bliss of Brahman is greater than all of that. Clearly, we're being rhetorical. Clearly, they're just throwing these numbers around to give us a sense that that bliss that we really seek, when we chase our desires in this world, think I'm going to get married, I'm going to find my partner, I'm going to get a house, I'm going to get a job, and I will be happy. And all of these things that we imagine will give us happiness. On the one hand, the Upanishads suggests that actually we always end up frustrated. We always end up somehow unfulfilled and missing something, number one. But number two, all of that is the bliss of Brahman is 100 times 109 times greater than all of that. Okay, so it's an Upanishadic passage trying to convince us that if we want happiness, we're looking in the wrong place. That if we want bliss, we're not going to find it through these bodies. We're not going to find it through our senses. We're not going to find it through the objects of the world. We can't. Metaphysically impossible. No one has ever managed to do so. People put on a big show, but no one has actually ever found complete satisfaction. And whatever little flickers of happiness we think we encounter, they don't last. Look at your own lives, my friend. You don't have to take this because the Upanishads say so. Just because it's written in a Sanskrit text that's 3,000 years old doesn't make it true. Do you examine your own life? Have you ever been completely and utterly, deeply, 100%, this is it, nirvana, perfection? And even if you say, yes, I had this experience or that experience, did it last? No. So therefore, that being the case, the Upanishads suggest we're looking in the wrong place. Bliss is not to be found. Where is it to be found? Brahman. What is this bliss of Brahman? So we got that little story to try to convince us that it's 100 times, 109 times greater than anything we can possibly conceive of. A young person owning the whole world. That's what else can you conceive of? That you have a perfect body and you own all the wealth in the world. Where else do you go from that in terms of conceptualizing happiness? If you're a materialist, if you think happiness is the material things, then what greater gain could you possibly have than a perfect body and owning all the wealth in the world? So they start off with that and say, okay, let's go with that then. Let's say that's the greatest thing you can have in this world. Imagine, they're being rhetorical. Wow, next round, 100. And the bliss of Brahman is, I don't know, I think it was 10 to the power 17. Okay, so that's it for this week. The readings are kind of light, and so I hope that means you will definitely read them. Anyway, you better read them for the quiz if you want to do well in the quiz. And we have another 1 week with the Upanishads, and we move into Vedanta. The later Upanishads start getting more systematic. The teachings become less obscure, less esoteric, less ancient, easier to understand, easier to interpret from the lens of later Hinduism. And so these older ones, I extracted the most user-friendly passages. Actually, a lot of it's very obscure. So I think you'll enjoy the next two Upanishads, and then we move on to Vedanta. Okay, so Brahman, right, our courses on God and Indian philosophy, and all sort of talk about God, right? So God is somehow or other the cause of everything, the creator of everything, the intelligence behind everything, the sustainer of everything, at least those basic qualities. Of course, God may be many other things that get developed, as you will see in our Indian traditions, but at the very least, God is eternal. Because if God came into being, well, who created God then? There must be some other God. And if you say God came out of nothing, well, how are you going to explain that? Remember, the Indian thinker just thinks it's a silly idea, that's not even worth philosophically engaging with. It's something that's nothing. It's just like, okay, well, you can't have a conversation. So remember the passage? The Brahman tells his son, Shvetaketu, Adulaka, what his name was, Adulaka, Aruni. How can that be so? How could something come from nothing? So that's not even given. If they knew about the Big Bang, they would say, well, what created the Big Bang? How can the Big Bang come from nothing? So science that can't go there. Science cannot answer that question. Cannot engage that question. As an honest scientist would say, our discipline begins at the Big Bang. We cannot. The minute we start talking about pre-Big Bang, we're not speaking as scientists. We're now speaking as philosophers, as metaphysicians, as theologians. We're not speaking as scientists, using induction and experimentation, verification, and duplication, and all that. So, so there we have it. So Brahman then, it exists. It's intelligence. We had a few passages. It thought, let me become many. So tying together some of these pieces from today. and it's blissful, the bliss of Brahman. Right, so hopefully those get the reading lights, get the points basic and simple, and hopefully they're clear for you. Okay, so we'll see you in the next recording. Won't see you, but we'll be in touch, I suppose, through Zoom in the next meeting.